The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the city. The streetlights flickered to life, one by one, as the evening rush settled in. The smell of fresh coffee and baked bread wafted from a small cafe on the corner, where people hurried in for their daily pick-me-up. The air was cool, but there was a kind of warmth that lingered in the spaces between the busy pedestrians, a sense of movement and urgency as they shuffled past one another. Inside the cafe, the sound of clinking mugs and low conversations filled the air. The atmosphere was cozy, but there was an edge of something else, something almost cold. People sat alone at tables, scrolling through their phones or reading their books, wrapped in their own worlds. In the far corner, a man sat alone, his weathered face hidden behind a worn-out coat. His eyes were distant, focused on nothing in particular as he sipped his drink slowly, as though savoring it despite its bitter taste. He wasn't someone you'd expect to see in a place like this. His clothes were frayed, his shoes had seen better days, and his hands trembled slightly as he lifted his cup to his lips. His name was Jack, and he had spent most of his life trying to survive the streets, trying to make something out of nothing. The city had forgotten him, along with countless others like him, and yet he persisted. His life had been a constant battle, one he had learned to fight with pride, no matter how many times it knocked him down. But today, as he sat in the corner of that cafe, there was a shift in the air. A man walked in, drawing eyes with his confident stride, his suit crisp and immaculate against the cozy, worn surroundings. His name was Charles, a young man who had carved out a life in the spotlight, rich, successful, and seemingly untouchable. He was a regular here, a businessman who came for his espresso, but today he was not quite himself. There was something almost restless about his presence, as though he, too, was seeking something real. As Charles ordered his coffee, he noticed Jack sitting alone in the corner. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and in that split second, something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't just the disparity in their clothes or their social standing, but the weight of life itself. Charles stood there, frozen for a second, before shaking himself back to reality and making his way to the counter. Jack didn't notice the momentary glance. He was used to being ignored, used to being invisible. People like him were never seen unless they were in the way. The moments of quiet solitude were his only refuge, and that's how he liked it, until today. He shifted in his seat, trying to adjust, but the discomfort of his body reminded him of his many struggles. The weight of the world seemed to settle deeper in his bones with each passing year. It was then that a voice interrupted the stillness of his thoughts. "Hey, is this seat taken?" Charles asked, pointing to the empty chair across from him. Jack looked up, surprised. No. It's free," he muttered, unsure of what to make of this sudden invitation. Charles sat down, setting his coffee on the table. There was a pause, a strange kind of awkwardness hanging in the air. Neither of them spoke at first. The hum of the cafe felt louder now, almost deafening, as though the world was holding its breath. Then Charles spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You look like you've been through a lot." Jack raised an eyebrow, the defensiveness rising instinctively. "You don't know anything about me." Charles didn't flinch. "No, I don't. But sometimes we all need to be seen. Just a little, you know." There was something genuine in his tone, something that reached through the thick walls Jack had built around himself over the years. Jack scoffed, glancing away. "Seen? By people like you. You can't fix what's broken. You can't even see it." Charles hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jack. He understood the anger, the distrust. He'd seen it before in his own life. The walls people built when they were tired of being overlooked. But something in Jack's eyes made him press on. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was real. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people stop pretending, when the layers are peeled back, and only the truth remains. Jack looked up at Charles, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, it felt like the world outside the cafe didn't exist at all. Just the two of them, alone in the quiet understanding that neither had asked for but both seemed to need. Jack spoke again, this time his voice softer, almost hesitant. "You really think anyone's gonna help me? I've been on my own too long. People like you don't care about people like me." Charles leaned forward, his voice steady and serious. "I don't know what you've been through, Jack. But I do know that it's never too late to ask for help." He paused, watching Jack carefully. "You don't have to do this alone." There was a long moment of silence, the kind that could change everything. Jack's gaze dropped to his hands, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had to fight. Jack walked down the narrow alleyway, his shoulders hunched against the chill of the evening air. The dim light from the street lamps barely touched the cracked pavement beneath his worn boots. His fingers, stiff from the cold, clutched a faded cardboard sign that read, "Veteran in need of help." He didn't expect much, never did. The city had long since forgotten him, along with too many others. He had learned to survive on the edges, unseen, unheard, and for the most part, that suited him just fine. But tonight felt different. The usual hum of traffic, the distant conversations from people passing by, seemed louder somehow. The world felt a little less far away, as though someone might just stop, take a moment, and look at him, not with pity or judgment, but with understanding. But Jack wasn't naive. He had long ago given up on that hope. So he slumped back against the brick wall, his eyes lowered, watching the cars zoom past, their bright headlights briefly illuminating his tired face. His military jacket was worn and frayed at the edges, a reminder of battles fought long ago, some on foreign soil, others in his mind. The weight of those memories clung to him like the layers of grime and dirt that covered his skin. He'd come back from war a different man, and the world around him hadn't seemed to notice, let alone care. And so, he had learned to live without hope, just one foot in front of the other, hoping the day would pass by without anyone asking too many questions. But that was before he noticed him. The man who walked with a kind of confidence that seemed out of place on this street. He was well-dressed, tall, with a presence that made Jack's weary eyes narrow. He didn't belong here, Jack thought, as the man stopped for a moment at the entrance of the alleyway, looking down at the ground, his gaze flickering briefly to Jack's sign. The man, Charles, took a deep breath before stepping forward. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement as he approached, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Jack stiffened, his hand tightening around the cardboard sign. He didn't want any part of this, didn't want some rich businessman making a charity case out of him. But Charles didn't speak right away. He stood there for a moment, taking in the sight of Jack, his tired eyes, his weary face. There was no judgment in his gaze, no hint of discomfort, just quiet recognition. Finally he spoke, his voice gentle, yet firm. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" His words hung in the air, soft but powerful. Jack looked up at him, caught off guard by the question. His throat tightened as a mixture of anger and frustration bubbled to the surface. He wasn't used to being seen, not like this. Certainly not by someone who looked like Charles. "What do you want?" Jack asked, his voice rough, edged with distrust. "A donation? Or do you want to take a picture of the poor veteran for your Instagram feed?" Charles didn't flinch at the words, didn't look away. Instead, he leaned down slightly, his eyes locking with Jack's. "No," he said simply. "I just want to know your story. What happened to you? To someone who fought for this country and ended up here?" The question struck deep, the rawness of it hitting Jack in a way he hadn't anticipated. It was the last thing he expected from a man who seemed to have everything. Jack's gaze dropped to the ground, the anger beginning to simmer away, replaced by something else, something deeper. He didn't speak for a long time, his fingers trembling as he rubbed the sign between his hands. Finally, his voice came out barely above a whisper. "You wouldn't understand. It's not the kind of thing you can fix." Charles took a step closer, his tone unwavering but full of care. "I don't want to fix anything, Jack. I just want to listen." The words hung between them, heavy and full of meaning. Jack felt his defenses begin to crack, but he was still reluctant. He had been burned before, too many times. He didn't trust easily, especially not someone like Charles, who seemed to have everything he could ever need. But there was something about him, something genuine, and for the first time in a long while, Jack let himself feel that flicker of something other than cynicism. "Listen," Jack said, his voice breaking slightly. "I came back from war, and no one cared. I had no family waiting for me, no one to help me find a way back to anything that felt like a life. I kept going. But there's nothing left in me to keep going for. You know, it's like I'm invisible." Charles didn't say anything, but Jack could feel his presence there, solid and unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush to offer some solution. He just stood there, letting Jack's words fall into the silence between them. Jack sighed, rubbing his face. "You probably think I'm pathetic. I am." Charles shook his head, a small, almost sad smile on his lips. "No, Jack, you're not pathetic. You're just forgotten. And that's the real tragedy." Jack's heart tightened at the words. Forgotten. He had always feared that, but hearing it out loud made it feel real in a way he hadn't expected. He looked up at Charles again, his defenses still high but starting to slip away. "So what now?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me? I don't need your pity." Charles took a deep breath, then reached into his jacket pocket. "I'm not here to give you pity, but I can offer you something else." He pulled out a business card, handing it to Jack with a steady hand. "If you want, I can help you get back on your feet. Not with charity, but with a chance. A real chance." Jack stared at the card, disbelief spreading across his face. It wasn't just money. It wasn't some empty promise. It was a way out, a lifeline thrown into the cold, dark waters of his life. But could he trust it? Could he trust him? "Why would you do that?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper, full of doubt. Charles's expression softened. "Because everyone deserves to be seen, and no one should be invisible, especially not someone who gave everything for this country." The days that followed felt like a blur for Jack. He couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Charles, the strange kindness that had come from nowhere. At night, when he closed his eyes, he could still feel the weight of the business card in his hand, the words, "a real chance," echoing in his mind. But every time he thought about it, doubt crept in like a dark shadow. What did someone like Charles really want from him? Was it all some kind of trick, a rich man's way of feeling good about himself? Jack had been let down too many times before, and he wasn't sure he could risk believing again. But there was also something in Charles's voice that made him hesitate. He wasn't offering handouts or charity. He was offering something deeper, a chance to stand up, to be seen in a way Jack had forgotten was possible. The more Jack thought about it, the more the idea gnawed at him, stirring something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But could he really take that step? Could he let himself trust again? It was late one evening when Jack finally made up his mind. The cold wind cut through the alley as he walked down the street, but something about the air felt different tonight. Lighter, less oppressive. His heart beat faster with every step. He had been to this spot 100 times, sitting on the same corner, the same wall, and waiting for something that never came. But tonight, he wasn't just waiting. He was moving. He didn't know what would happen when he got there, but he was going. Charles was sitting at the same cafe table where they'd met before, his back straight, his expression calm but expectant. Jack's pulse quickened as he approached, and for a moment he wondered if he'd made a mistake. He hesitated, taking in the sight of Charles. Everything about him seemed so different from what Jack knew. But then Charles looked up, and his face softened, his smile warm but not condescending. It wasn't pity in his eyes, just genuine care, as though he was glad to see Jack here, in this place, at this moment. "Jack," Charles said, his voice steady, "I'm glad you came." Jack didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, unsure of what to do with the sudden surge of emotions that flooded him. It felt overwhelming. "I'm not sure what I'm doing here," Jack finally muttered, his voice thick with uncertainty. Charles didn't flinch. "That's okay. You don't have to know all the answers right now. But I do know this. You don't have to keep fighting this alone. You've already made it this far. The next step is just trusting yourself, trusting that there's something better waiting for you." Jack swallowed hard, feeling his throat tighten. "But I don't know how to trust anymore. I've been let down too many times." "I get it," Charles said, leaning forward, his tone softening. "I can't promise you everything will be easy, Jack. But I can promise that you won't be invisible anymore. You deserve better than this life. You deserve a chance." The words hit Jack like a tidal wave. His mind spun with doubt, with fear of what could happen if he took that leap, but the weight of his years on the street, the loneliness, the constant struggle, seemed to push him forward. Maybe he was tired of being invisible. Maybe he was tired of being nothing more than a shadow in the background. Jack sat down, feeling the familiar weight of his own hesitation pressing down on him. "And what do you want from me?" he asked, his voice raw. "What's the catch?" Charles leaned back, his hands resting on the table. "There's no catch, Jack. All I want is to give you a shot. A real one. You don't have to take it if you're not ready, but I think you can make something of yourself. You've already proven you're strong enough to survive this far." The room seemed to quiet around them, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack allowed himself to breathe deeply, to imagine the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than just surviving. The thought of being more than just a shadow, of walking with his head held high, of having a place where he truly belonged, it was all so foreign to him, but it wasn't impossible. Jack looked at Charles, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I'm ready for all that." Charles smiled, a gentle but unwavering look in his eyes. "You don't have to have it all figured out. Just take the first step. That's all any of us can do." It was a simple thing, a small step. But for Jack, it felt like the beginning of something new. He didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was just about trusting the process, trusting that there was something more waiting for him if he could just take that chance. As Jack left the cafe that evening, something inside him shifted. The cold air still wrapped around him, but it didn't feel as heavy. The city around him, once so cold and indifferent, seemed just a little warmer now. For the first time in years, he felt like he might just have a future a chance to reclaim the parts of himself that had been lost for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, but it would be worth it. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Jack felt ready to try. The days blurred into each other, but Jack could feel something changing within him. The decision he had made to trust Charles, to accept the offer, weighed on him, but it wasn't as heavy as it used to be. There were moments when doubt crept in, like when he passed a homeless shelter and saw familiar faces, familiar struggles. His mind would race, questioning if he truly belonged in a place like the one Charles had promised, a chance, a new life. He wasn't sure if he deserved it, but the simple thought that someone believed in him, that someone saw him as more than just a man broken by life, made the weight of his past a little easier to carry. Then came the day when Charles invited him to meet again. This time, Jack wasn't sure what to expect. He dressed in the best clothes he could find, an old jacket and a pair of shoes that barely fit, but it was the best he had. When he stepped into the room Charles had arranged, it didn't feel like any place Jack had been before. It was warm, comfortable, and there were people everywhere, people who didn't look at him like he was invisible. Instead, they looked at him like he mattered. They smiled at him as if they knew his story, as if they recognized something in him that he hadn't even recognized in himself. Charles was there, of course, standing at the center of the room, talking to a group of people who seemed genuinely interested in what he had to say. When he saw Jack, his face lit up. "Jack," he said with a genuine smile, walking over to him. "I'm so glad you came." Jack nodded but felt his nerves flare up. He had never been in a situation like this before, and it was hard to ignore the discomfort gnawing at his insides. But Charles's presence was calming. He led Jack to a small table, where they sat down together, away from the bustling crowd. "How's everything going?" Charles asked gently, his eyes not just looking at Jack, but through him, like he was seeing all the potential that Jack had yet to fully recognize. It's different," Jack said, his voice shaky. "I'm not used to this. People treating me like I'm not invisible." Charles smiled, but there was something deeper in his gaze. "You're not invisible, Jack. You never were. You just needed to see that yourself." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know how to respond to that. "I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can live up to what you think I can be," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Charles reached across the table, placing a hand on Jack's. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to take the next step. That's all we ever really have, right? The next step." The words hit harder than he expected. Jack thought about them for a moment, trying to understand what they meant for him. He'd spent so much time in survival mode, just getting through each day, that the idea of taking steps toward something better felt impossible. But maybe Charles was right. Maybe he didn't have to know everything. Maybe he could just try. A few weeks later, Jack found himself in front of a small, modest building, a place that Charles had arranged for him to stay. It wasn't much, but it was his. It was a roof over his head, a place where he could sleep without the fear of being moved along, without the harsh reality of the street. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt a sense of relief, like he could finally breathe. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. The next step was harder. Jack had agreed to take on some work at a local business, something simple at first. But the moment he walked into the office, he felt the familiar sting of doubt return. He wasn't qualified. He didn't know how to do anything that the others seemed to do so effortlessly. He wasn't sure how he even belonged in a place like this. His mind raced with insecurities, but then he remembered what Charles had told him. Just take the next step. Jack took a deep breath and walked over to his desk. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was pretending. He was doing something, even if it was small. He was taking that next step, and that was enough. As the weeks passed, Jack grew more comfortable. The people around him treated him with respect, and for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, even if it was just a small part of a much bigger picture. But the real change, the real shift, came when Charles called him one afternoon. "Jack," he said, his voice steady, "I need to show you something." Confused, Jack followed Charles to a meeting room where a group of people stood, their eyes on him as he entered. "This is your moment," Charles said, his voice soft but filled with meaning. Jack froze for a moment, unsure of what was happening. But then Charles spoke again, his words cutting through the tension in the room. "I want everyone here to meet Jack. He's been a part of this from the beginning. He's someone who understands the real value of hard work, of perseverance. And I'm proud to stand here with him today." Jack's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight, to being recognized like this. But as the people in the room clapped for him, a wave of something he hadn't felt in so long washed over him. It wasn't just relief. It was pride. He didn't know if he would ever feel like he belonged fully in a world he had once been so disconnected from, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. Like maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he could grow. Charles stood beside him, and Jack felt a knot in his throat. "Thank you," Jack said quietly, his voice barely audible but full of meaning. "Thank you for seeing me." Charles smiled. "You've always been here, Jack. It just took you a while to see it." And for the first time, Jack didn't just see it. He believed it. The change in Jack's life didn't come all at once, but slowly, like the dawn breaking after a long, endless night. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he questioned everything, wondering if he was just chasing something that wasn't meant for him. But as the weeks turned into months, he found that he was slowly finding his way. Each step was small, but it felt significant. Jack had a room now, a steady job, and even some semblance of a routine. These were things he had only dreamed of in the past, but now they were becoming his reality. The real transformation came on a day that was like any other. Jack had finished his shift at the office, and as he stepped outside, the weight of the world didn't seem as heavy on his shoulders. He had grown used to the small victories, the little moments of peace that he'd never thought possible. It wasn't perfect. He wasn't where he wanted to be yet, but he was on his way. For the first time in a long time, Jack felt like he had something to look forward to. That evening, Charles invited Jack to a gathering at a local veterans center. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a few people, a small event meant to honor the men and women who had served. But for Jack, it was monumental. He had spent so many years living in the shadows, feeling like no one saw him. But tonight he was going to be acknowledged, not as a forgotten soul, but as someone who had earned a place in this world. And that meant everything to him. When Jack walked into the center, the applause that greeted him was overwhelming. He hadn't expected it, hadn't anticipated that his journey, his struggles, would matter to anyone but him. But there they were, people who had been through their own battles, their own journeys. They stood for him, not out of pity, but in recognition. It was a moment of validation he had never imagined. He wanted to shrink into the shadows, to step back and pretend he wasn't the center of attention. But Charles was there beside him, guiding him, reminding him that he was worthy of this moment. As Jack stood at the front, Charles handed him a small medal, a symbol of his perseverance, his courage. For a moment, Jack's hands trembled, not out of fear, but out of gratitude. The weight of the medal was nothing compared to the weight of what it represented, the years of struggle, the moments of doubt, the days he thought he would never make it out. But here he was, standing tall, recognized, not as a broken man, but as someone who had fought and had found his way back. The applause felt like a warm embrace, a reminder that he wasn't invisible anymore. He wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was Jack, a man who had fought for his place in the world and had earned it. The crowd's cheers faded, but the warmth of the moment stayed with him. As the event wrapped up, Charles found Jack standing alone by the door, looking out at the city. "You did it," Charles said, his voice filled with pride. Jack turned, his eyes a little misty. "I don't know if I could have done it without you. You believed in me when I didn't." Charles smiled, his gaze steady. "I didn't just believe in you, Jack. I knew you had it in you. You just needed someone to remind you of that." Jack nodded slowly, feeling something shift deep within him. He wasn't the same man who had walked into the cafe that first day. He had changed, grown stronger, more sure of himself. But he knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a road he had to walk alone. As he left the center that night, the city felt different. The streets, once so cold and indifferent, now seemed full of possibilities. Jack didn't know where life would take him, but for the first time, he was ready for whatever came next. He had been given a chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The future, for once, didn't feel uncertain. It felt like a promise, a new chapter just beginning. In the months that followed, Jack continued to grow. He stayed at the job Charles had helped him secure, working hard, learning, and slowly but surely gaining the confidence he had once lost. He began to build relationships, to connect with people who saw him not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone with purpose. He even started volunteering at local shelters, using his story to inspire others who felt as lost as he had once been. Jack knew the journey was far from over, but he also knew that he wasn't the same person he was when he had first met Charles. The scars of his past would always be there, but they no longer defined him. They were part of his story, yes, but they didn't control it. He had learned that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, Jack was excited about the next step. Because now, he knew he had the strength to keep moving forward. Charles had given him the greatest gift, belief in himself, and that was something no one could ever take away. As the months passed, Jack's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The days that once seemed long and uncertain now had a purpose, a direction he hadn't known he needed. Every morning, he woke up in his modest apartment, greeted by the warmth of a home that was truly his. It wasn't much, bare walls, a simple bed, and an old chair, but to Jack it was everything. It was a place to rest, a place to dream again, something he hadn't done in years. He had a routine now, work, rest, and the small acts of kindness he had started to show himself. And while he wasn't yet who he wanted to be, he was so much farther along than where he had started. Charles had remained a steady presence in his life, a guiding figure that Jack never expected, but had grown to rely on. Charles didn't just help him with the physical things, the job, the shelter, the basics of survival. What Charles had given Jack was something far more important, a belief in himself. And though Jack wasn't sure he'd ever fully understand the depth of that gift, he knew he would spend the rest of his life trying to honor it. There were moments, however, when doubt crept in. It came when Jack looked around at the others he had once known on the streets, those he still saw sometimes, slumped against walls or huddled under blankets on cold benches. The guilt would sting, and he'd wonder, why me? Why did I get a chance, and they didn't? Those thoughts would rattle around in his head until he saw the faces of the people he had started to care about. People like Charles, who reminded him that the past didn't define him. It was the choices he made today that mattered. One afternoon, As Jack was walking through the park on his way home from work, he saw a familiar face. It was a woman, sitting on a bench, her face hidden behind a scarf. At first, he thought it was just another passerby, but something in her posture caught his attention. It was the same weary slouch, the same defeated air that he had once carried with him, the same look of someone who didn't know how to ask for help, but who desperately needed it. Jack stopped. He wasn't sure what drew him in. Maybe it was the way she reminded him of himself, or maybe it was the desire to make sure someone didn't feel as invisible as he once had. He took a deep breath, walked over, and sat down beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Jack wasn't sure where to start, but he finally broke it with a simple, "Are you okay?" The woman looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and something Jack could barely place. "Why do you care?" she asked, her voice rough and cautious. Jack swallowed hard, trying to find the words. He'd been where she was, sitting in the cold, feeling like the world was passing him by. "I care," he said softly, "because someone cared about me once. And that made all the difference." She gave him a skeptical look, but didn't pull away. For a while, they just sat there, two strangers sharing a moment of quiet understanding. Jack didn't have all the answers, but he could see the same uncertainty in her eyes that he'd once carried in his own. And maybe, just maybe, if he could be the person to help her see that there was still hope, he'd be able to repay the kindness that Charles had shown him. They talked for a while, and Jack offered to help her with whatever she needed. It wasn't much, just a conversation, some advice on local shelters and support groups. But as they spoke, Jack saw something in her change, a flicker of hope, just like the one that had sparked inside him all those months ago. And for the first time, he realized that redemption wasn't just about him. It was about paying it forward, sharing the chance he had been given with others who still needed it. That evening, Jack found himself in front of his apartment, looking at the small, simple building that had become his sanctuary. He paused for a moment, taking it all in. The laughter of children playing in the street, the distant hum of traffic, the warmth of the lights shining from windows. It wasn't perfect. Life still had its challenges, but Jack knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the man he used to be. And he was no longer invisible. Charles had given him the chance to start over, and now it was his turn to pass that chance on. Jack had learned that the real power of change wasn't in the big gestures or grand acts of kindness. It was in the quiet moments, the small decisions, the willingness to care when no one else would. It was in showing someone that they weren't alone, that they mattered. And in that simple act, both lives could change. As Jack closed the door behind him, he felt something inside him settle, a peace he hadn't known in years. The future, once so uncertain, now felt full of possibilities. There were still days when he doubted himself, days when the weight of the past threatened to drag him down. But he knew that as long as he had the strength to keep moving forward, there was always hope. And for the first time, he truly believed that redemption wasn't just something he had received. It was something he could give.